Hello everyone, and thank you very much to Catherine and Gabrielle for the invitation. I'm tackling big data, which we were warned about in the first session, and I don't think I'm going to say anything that's going to make Rupert feel any better at all about sustainability of some of this stuff. So, humanities researchers are increasingly finding themselves having to work not just with digitised materials, but with born digital data at scale, which is what I'm starting to call big data, I think. The archived web, for example, is the big data that it will be impossible for historians to avoid, however hard they try, and believe me, some of them are trying very hard indeed. The web was 25 years old in 2014, and an archiving process has been in place for almost 20 years, when the Internet Archive in the US began its invaluable work. For contemporary historians at least, this is beginning to look like a reasonable chronological span. The UK has traditionally adopted a 30-year rule in relation to the public release of non-sensitive government records. But in 2013, the National Archives began a move towards releasing records when they are just 20 years old. That is, the same age as the earliest instances of archived websites. It's becoming very hard to argue that this is not material worthy of historical study. I would go further and ask how you could possibly write the history of the developed world in the late 20th and early 21st centuries without including this data in your analysis. Historians are used to working with books, letters, diaries, newspapers, government records and official communications, and a variety of other analogue materials. But these all now have a digital form. In some instances, this digital form has more or less superseded its printed or handwritten predecessor. Blogs replace personal diaries, for example, and the volume of emails written every day vastly outstrips the number of physical letters posted, particularly for personal rather than business communication. There are problems inherent in the production, collection, and delivery of both the digitized and the born digital. When has data ever not been problematic? But we are more familiar with the difficulties posed by the former, even if we don't always know how to solve them. For example, researchers have become accustomed to the errors introduced by the OCR process, and how the degree of accuracy of transcription might change over time, even within the same collection, as available technology has improved. People are more aware of what they are searching, and are not so easily taken in by the apparently perfect facsimile that's presented to them. They are beginning to understand the trade-off between precision and recall, and what the adoption of a particular search algorithm might mean in this context. A colleague at the University of Utrecht expressed this as needing to develop algorithmic thinking, by which he did not mean being able to write code, but rather appreciating how that code might affect both the shape of the data that you search and the results that you find. This is true for born digital data too, but there are other complexities arising from scale and from the impossibility of complete comprehension of the data. And these complexities are not generic. Existence in a digital form is no guarantee of similarity any more than is existence in a written form. There are many differences between a medieval manuscript and a 20th century paperback novel, just as there are between a Twitter account and an HTML web page. The latter two, however, are changed during the process of archiving, so that an archived web page or snapshot is not the same as the live web page of which it purports to be a copy. Niels Brugger describes this data as reborn digital, to emphasize the difference between the live and the archived, and begin to draw out what this means for researchers. Over the past 3 years, I've begun to explore some of the challenges of working with the archived web in particular. In recognition of the fact that web archives are an increasingly important resource for humanities researchers, the AHRC awarded funding for an 18-month project to work with the existing archive of UK web space. Big UK domain data for the Arts and Humanities was a collaboration with the British Library, the Oxford Internet Institute, and Josh here worked on the project, and Aarhus University in Denmark. Our starting point was that, despite the enormous potential of this material, we do not yet have either the expertise or the tools to work with it effectively. Both the data itself and the process of collection are poorly understood, and it's possible only to draw the broadest of conclusions using current analytical methods, if they can be called conclusions at all. The project team have been working with a dataset derived from the crawl of the UK domain undertaken by the Internet Archive between 1996 and April 2013, which totals approximately 65 terabytes, and using it to develop a theoretical and methodological framework within which to study the UK web in particular, but web archives more broadly. That dataset is already dauntingly large, but the scale of the problem facing both archival organisations and researchers is clear when you look at the first full domain crawl undertaken by the British Library in 2013. That's the point at which legal deposit legislation was extended to include non-print material. This crawl started with 3.86 million what are called seed websites, and this initial list led to the capture of 1.9 billion URLs, web pages, documents, images, sound files, and so on. The whole process took 70 days and generated 30.84 terabytes of data. That is almost half as much again as for the previous 17 and a half years. With at least one full domain crawl scheduled to be undertaken annually in the UK, we are soon going to be dealing with very big data indeed, at least in humanities terms. It's probably worth mentioning here that the nature of the crawling process means that there are multiple versions of the archive of the UK web. The Internet Archive started in 1996 with a particular list of seed websites, which linked to other sites in a certain order, and so on exponentially. The focus of this crawl was international, so UK sites will have been acquired in a different order from, for example, the British Library crawl, which is limited solely to the .uk top-level domain. Both will differ again from the archive produced by the Common Crawl, a non-profit organisation which builds and maintains an open repository of web crawl data for public use. We know that these datasets differ, but we don't know what that difference looks like. There's a fascinating research project to be done to compare the shapes of the archived web and help to guide researchers through the implications of that. At the moment, the challenges posed by this data mean that web archives are rarely used, even by those who know that they exist. And we were keen in our project to demonstrate their value for humanities researchers and to build a community who would advocate for their significance. To this end, we awarded bursaries to 10 researchers from a number of different disciplines who came up with a fascinating range of projects focusing on the archived web as a primary source. They ranged from analysing disability action groups online to studying the Ministry of Defence's recruitment strategy, from examining discourse about heritage to looking at beat literature in the contemporary imagination. It was fascinating that 2 of the projects were about poetry, which was not something that immediately springs to mind when you're thinking about using this material. As the researchers refined their questions, they worked alongside technical developers at the British Library to co-design a new interface and tools which, as far as possible, would allow them to do what they wanted to do. And what they wanted to do at the end of the project was not the same as what they thought they were going to want to do at the start of it. The resulting Shine interface, which is hosted at the British Library, provides access to one of the largest full-text indexes of web archive files in the world. We were there as the largest for about 2 weeks until the Danish archive produced a larger one, which is a bit annoying. The coverage of the Internet Archive in the US is much greater, of course, but at the time of writing, access still primarily relies on knowing and searching for a particular URL. This is severely limiting for researchers, as you can only find something if you know that it previously existed, and serendipitous discovery is effectively curtailed. To give you an idea of what this means, the Institute of Historical Research website is still available on the live web and has the URL history.ac.uk. You might have a reasonable expectation that searching for this URL would enable you to find everything you were looking for. Entering it into the Wayback Machine produces a satisfying number of results, 536 captures of the website dating from March 2000. So far so good, it seems. However, I happen to know that the site has not always had that URL. Indeed, its current iteration is the 3rd. Each of those now defunct addresses produces a quite different set of results. One reveals only 211 captures, but crucially starting at a much earlier date, the 27th of December 1996, while the other reveals 102. Just as an aside, as well as illustrating the difficulties of using the existing tools for research, this exercise also shows the importance of oral history for an understanding of the early days of the internet and web. I still remember the important pieces of information in this instance, but as of the 1st of May this year, I no longer work at the Institute, and that institutional memory has started to leave along with me. That's a relatively trivial example, but there are many people whose experiences need to be captured while we still can. At the moment, the focus even of our new Shine interface is still very much on searching, and I think it's fair to say that this has highlighted some problems with the way in which researchers think about building queries. To illustrate the difficulty, Richard de Zwart, who was interested in tracing Euroscepticism online, soon hit up against the problem that UKIP was the name of an internet service provider, as well as the acronym used for the UK Independence Party, which is of course a prime locus of opposition to EU membership. Another researcher, Gareth Millwood, was forced to reduce the number of charities that he included in his case study, because the tendency for disability organisations to rebrand themselves with names such as Scope or Mind made it impossible to generate meaningful results. A reliance on algorithmically ranked search results designed to narrow down rather than to expose the scope of a collection is a clear problem when we are dealing with big data. Some of these difficulties can, of course, be ironed out through training, through experience, and through tweaks to the interface itself. For example, proximity searching is now explicitly available in the Shine Advanced Search. Date ranges can be applied, file formats can be excluded, and website and page titles can be factored in. Perhaps most useful is the option to restrict searching to particular domain suffixes, so that a search for David Cameron, for example, produces 1.25 million results, but limiting this to parliament.uk produces only just over 6,000. You still cannot be sure that all these are references to the current UK Prime Minister, David Cameron, but it is a much more manageable dataset with which to work. Needless to say, it's much easier to find somebody with a name like Barack Obama than Gordon Brown in this data. Having an unusual name really helps. More difficult to deal with are the problems inherent in the data. The archival unit is the web page, although as I will explain in a minute, it's not quite as simple as that. Moreover, given the legal frameworks within which European institutions with archiving responsibilities are forced to work, the page appears in a solely national context. There are some variations between countries. For example, in Denmark, the Royal Library is allowed to archive content relating to Denmark, but which does not fall within the .uk top-level domain. They have an advantage of language there. It's much easier to find Danish material outside their own domain than it would be English language. Generally, however, the web archiving process is erecting artificial barriers which simply don't exist on the international and networked live web. Returning to Richard de Zwart's research, for example, he was able to study how Euroscepticism manifests itself in the UK web domain, but could not easily trace responses within the European Union. And incidentally, no one currently has formal responsibility for archiving the .eu domain, which speaks to the volumes to the sustainability problems. Richard was able to look at the links between websites opposed to greater European integration, but only provided that they end with .dk. Oh, excuse me. Then there is the fact that a web page consists of multiple elements, which at the moment cannot be isolated or disaggregated. This is currently a real hindrance to both proximity searching and large-scale analysis. Advertising tickers, for example, were common at the turn of the century, and frequently bear no relation to the content of the web page with which they've been captured. A rolling news item about a fire in the Channel Tunnel, for example, might form part of multiple captures of the website of a local newspaper in the north of England, the Yorkshire Post, that's not going to be terribly useful for anyone who's interested in the south coast of England. It might be argued that this is only a distraction, momentarily drawing the researcher down a blind alley, but this assumes that he or she will have the chance to read everything. This is not necessarily, or even generally, the case with data at this scale. Similarly, a postcode which appears in the footer of a page may be the address of a hosting company, rather than of the business or individual with which the page is concerned, so geolocation becomes problematic immediately. A colleague at the British Library, Jason Webber, wanted to explore the often repeated axiom that supporters of Manchester United are overwhelmingly based in the south of Britain, rather than in the city of Manchester itself. Sure enough, the postcode most commonly associated with members of the club was a London one, E98. E98, however, indicates Wapping, which was and remains a centre of newspaper publishing in the capital. It's not really surprising that a tabloid newspaper like The Sun has a lot of coverage of a leading football club, so the data's not telling you what you immediately think it is. Then there is the way in which the data itself has been collected. Fundamentally, we don't really know what it looks like. It is, of course, unstructured, but there are other unique issues to be addressed. While the British Library's ongoing full domain crawl is as comprehensive as it's possible to be, this really isn't the case with the dataset derived from the Internet Archive. As I've already mentioned, it started from a small seed list of websites and took time to acquire the full range of URLs which it now contains. In addition, the rate of data collection has not been consistent over time. There are peaks and troughs which it is relatively easy to identify for a single website, but not necessarily at scale. Returning to the Institute of Historical Research, you can see superficially what's going on. Taking the results for its very first URL, the site as a whole has been captured 198 times between December 1996 and September 2014, but only 3 times in 1998, 24 in 2003, 3 times again in 2007, and so on. The 3 captures in 2007 were all within the space of 4 weeks, so any changes during the rest of that year are not reflected in the archive at all. This pattern will not be consistent across websites or national domains, and the reason for the disparities are not documented. So while a researcher may know that these differences exist, it's very difficult systematically to allow for them. Anyone who is concerned with the development of trends, whether linguistic, social, or political, is immediately on very shaky ground if it's not possible to identify what is a genuine peak of activity in relation to a particular phenomenon and what is simply a function of the data collection process. There are subtle hierarchies at work in the collection process too. Sites which are very active or deemed to be important in some way are crawled much more frequently than relatively static sites, or those which are not thought to be of particular significance for national life. In many ways, this is both sensible and necessary. A constantly changing and well-used website, such as the BBC's, should be captured more than an individual blog, no matter how socially and culturally interesting. And that became very apparent in the recent discussion about the BBC food recipes disappearing from the website. The British Library was out there straight away saying, don't worry, we've captured this. You'll only be able to see it on site in the British Library, but we've still got it. With all those problems, given that the Web Archive contains no contextual information about usage, no analytics to give a sense of relative popularity, how apparent are these hierarchies going to be to historians in future years? We know that the BBC website is important at the moment. In 200 years' time, is that going to be clear? Once again, it's scale that gets in the way. At the moment, at least, it's simply not possible to document the minutiae of the crawl process. As if this was not enough, there are undocumented variations in the depth to which particular sites are crawled. Some may be captured in their entirety, either consistently or only on occasion. Others may have been crawled to just 1 or 2 navigational levels. Sometimes multimedia content will have been archived effectively. At other times, images and advertisements may be missing or only partially captured. In this example, a sound file embedded on the home page of the British Library has not been captured along with the rest of the content. Here, it's at least possible both to identify and access what's missing, as there is a link to a subsequent capture of the file held elsewhere in the archive. But this is far from the usual experience. Looking at another capture of the IHR homepage, there are a couple of logos missing at the top left. We know this because there is some accompanying explanatory text. But further down the page, we can see that an image is absent, but not what it might have been. It's arguable whether this is anything genuinely novel, rather than an old problem of the survival of evidence filtered through a new expectation that it's somehow possible to keep everything. This notion of comprehensiveness exists simultaneously in the popular consciousness with the counter-narrative that we are about to or have already entered a digital dark age, which will see the historical record lost for future generations. Digital dark age reared its head in the papers again yesterday. It pops up about every 3 months, I think. Neither of these things, of course, is true, but questions of survival and loss do seem to loom particularly large in relation to born digital data. This is to ignore the fact that the primary sources we value so much from earlier periods have in large part survived through historical accident. One particular monastic library burnt to the ground while another did not. One individual was more diligent at keeping his correspondence than another. One national archive was bombed during the Second World War, while another was spared when an incendiary device failed to go off. I started out as a medieval historian, and I quickly became used to working with and around gaps, to speculating about the representative nature of a particular set of records, to trying to reconstruct a legal code from vague references to it in other documents. Ultimately, it just wasn't possible to know what was missing, so it was better to celebrate the fact that so much had survived. Maybe the difference in focus comes from our ability to know precisely what we don't have when we are considering born digital data. The earliest capture of the IHR website, or hypertext internet server, dates from December 1996, but I know that the website went live in August 1993. I'm immediately confronted with the fact that more than 3 years' worth of data has been lost. Data loss is also a very real presence in our daily lives, whether it's the disappearance of whole services like the BBC Food site, which once seemed essential, or the failure to back up a much-used computer. Similarly, without wishing to underestimate the numbers of people who have been disenfranchised by the digital, it's undoubtedly the case that there are greater opportunities than ever before to be a content creator. It's our own data which might be susceptible to loss, and I suspect that we feel that rather more keenly. The patchiness of the data collection that I've outlined does, however, introduce what I think really is a new problem. The researcher may be presented with a version of a web page that never actually existed. The Internet Archive, from which our data was drawn, makes use of the Memento time travel for the web protocol. This searches across various web archives to find prior versions of a particular page instance, or memento. It then reconstructs the page, drawing from multiple mementos to create the best possible representation of the page as it existed at a particular point in time. A snapshot of the British Library homepage on the 20th of July 2009, for example, is reconstructed using 14 mementos from 4 different archives covering a period of 4 months. This is the nearest we can get to knowing what that page looked like at that particular point in time, but it was not viewed by any human being in 2009. The potential results of this temporal incoherence were discussed last year in a fascinating presentation to the International Internet Preservation Consortium by Scott Ainsworth, Michael Nelson, and Herbert van der Sompel. They used the example of an online weather forecast for Storm Lake, Iowa, accessed via the Wayback Machine. In their terminology, there's a root memento, the bulk of the page, which is given a date of the 9th of December 2004, when it was archived. The dates associated with other embedded mementos are not visible without their own labelling, but their research revealed that the radar image to the bottom left, showing a completely cloudless sky, was captured 9 months after most of the rest of the content on the page. That explains the discrepancy between the text description of the weather conditions on the 9th of December as 5 degrees with light drizzle and the apparently contemporaneous sunny radar image. In their sample dataset, at least 5% of pages were shown to have some form of temporal violation, so that's a problem that we're really going to have to get to grips with. This is a very new challenge for researchers. How can you trust what you're looking at? How can you have any confidence at all that the elements on an archived page relate to each other in anything other than the most superficially coherent way, and sometimes not even superficially coherent? And how far does this matter when increasingly there is no single definitive view even of a live web page? The mobile view of a web page, or the shape that it assumes in responsive mode on a variety of devices, is generally not present in the archive. One possible solution to some of these questions is browser emulation, as illustrated by the rather wonderful old web today. You can, for example, view an archived web page as it would have appeared to a user of Netscape Navigator 4.8 16 years ago, immediately nostalgic for those of a certain age, but genuine enlightening for those who never experienced its doomed battle for supremacy with Internet Explorer. It's easy to criticize emulation. You are, after all, still using a modern laptop or tablet and not a PC from 2000. But it's one answer to the problem of at least partially capturing what it was like to interact with the web at a given point in time. The difficulties are perhaps thrown into sharper relief in the context of computer games, which are also being preserved by the Internet Archive. While it's great to be able to play a version of Space Invaders dating from the late 1980s, once you've been able to work out the newly assigned but undocumented keystrokes, that is, this is very far removed from the lived experience of an 80s teenager spending a Saturday afternoon with her friends in an arcade. Perhaps we're expecting too much. How far have we ever been able to understand what it was really like to read from a commonplace book in the 17th century and to piece together the specific contexts in which this activity would have occurred? Finally, for web archives at least, further complexity is added by the problem of duplication. Websites are crawled irrespective of whether they have changed since the last time they were captured, and this results in multiple duplicates in the archive. For the Buddha project, we tried to make allowance for this and removed identical instances of web pages from the dataset, even though that's problematic in archival terms. And it is in any case something of a blunt tool. A page with a dynamically changing date field, for example, but otherwise completely unaltered content, will still appear multiple times. As in so many of my examples, this particular problem is not confined to web archives. Anyone who has worked with newspapers will be aware of the challenges posed by multiple editions and the reuse of articles by multiple different titles. But the combination of uncertainties posed by web archives is perhaps uniquely challenging. And lack of awareness of these problems can seriously distort research. To take one example, this n-gram compares absolute numbers of references in the archive to malaria, tuberculosis, and Ebola. Taken at face value, it seems to illustrate a significant increase in mention of all terms, rising more or less to a peak in 2010, with some interesting-looking dips in previous years. But in fact, this is what any n-gram based on absolute numbers will look like. There's not very much data in the archive at the start of the period, so the curve will always be upwards. There are always periods of reduced data collection, which will cause dips in the graph at the same points. The results are essentially meaningless. A graph showing the relative number of mentions compared to the archive as a whole reveals a very different picture. From 1999 onwards, malaria clearly predominates as a term, and there is an interesting peak in references to Ebola the following year. This kind of visualization can be enormously useful as a route into complex data, but it's no substitute for understanding the data in the first place. Once you do begin to understand the data, however, visualization can be extremely effective. This series of graphs produced by the British Library, drawing on a representative sample of the larger archive, reveals the waning importance of universities in the UK domain, and it really is a rather sad story. In 1996, the ac.uk domain in red accounted for 39% of all links captured in the dataset. But by 2008, this figure had declined to just 1%. Neither of these visualizations allow us to understand why something is happening, but they do reveal information which can only be detected at scale. The question of how much importance we ascribe to a link, fundamentally what it means, is of course much more complex and will vary depending on a huge range of criteria. To date, and necessarily, much of the activity around the archived web has focused on the logistics of harvesting, storing, and making available in some form this enormous and growing dataset. We are now just starting to explore it as a primary source, and we will undoubtedly begin to acquire the necessary skills and develop appropriate methodologies, although I really like the analogy that we are the monkey at that very early stage. The importance of doing so is obvious. Web and related social media archives are and will be key primary sources for historians and many other types of researchers. To take just one example, what would the history of the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence from the UK look like if researchers only had access to official documents and mainstream media? The eventual closeness of the vote would seem inexplicable without an understanding of how campaigning and debate played out online. All of these questions are brought sharply into focus by a 2014 study which found that 70% of the URLs within the Harvard Law Review, and more significantly 50% of those within United States Supreme Court opinions, no longer link to the originally cited information. Where you have a legal system based on precedent, that's a real problem. The material has disappeared from the live web, but remains in the web archive. There's a clear imperative to get to grips with this data if we're to understand our own recent past. But as I suggested earlier, we're not simply dealing with web archives. They are just one of the many types of born digital data which are beginning to pose challenges for both memory institutions and researchers. I've managed to get this far without mentioning Twitter, but I'm afraid it's got to that point in the day. A great deal of criticism has, rather unfairly I think, been directed at the Library of Congress and its agreement to archive Twitter. It's no secret that we're unlikely to get access to that data anytime soon, and the reasons are obvious. In January 2013, the library revealed that for the period 2006 to 2010, it is faced with, quote, approximately 21 billion tweets, each with more than 50 accompanying metadata fields, such as place and description. And those were still relatively early days for Twitter. Now around 500 million tweets a day are generated. For researchers who are reluctant to wait, there are options to work directly with the company itself, but it's very protective of its data, and this is not an option for most people, or indeed projects. One possibility is to use the Twitter API to build your own archive, but that's when terms and conditions come into play. While you are at liberty to download the archive of your own account, and it's something of a relief to know that this still counts as personal data to which you have rights of access, when dealing with data created by other people, the only piece of information that should be stored, let alone shared with anyone else, is the unique ID associated with each tweet, so none of the text, none of the metadata. And this means that any research is ultimately reliant on Twitter to maintain public access to the information associated with that ID, as well as on individuals not to delete what they have written. An ID for a subsequently deleted tweet is worthless, and this renders a great deal of research in this field unreproducible, through no fault of the researcher. This highlights another problem of working with certain kinds of born digital data, and that is our reliance on private companies to preserve information for us. Twitter at least allows access to its data, however limited, and has been prepared to engage with a major library to explore permanent archival access. What of Facebook and the myriad other social media platforms which ebb and flow across our screens? We cannot expect corporations to archive our data because that's not what they are for. They will continue to do so only for as long as it supports their commercial goals, which in most cases means refining the targeting of advertising. It's very easy to see historical data losing its value in this context. Knowing what someone liked when they were 25 is probably not a very good indicator of what they will like when they are 45. In some cases, archiving institutions have a statutory obligation which overrides such legal and commercial considerations. This is the case in the UK, for example, where the National Archives is not only responsible for archiving the government's web presence, but its social media too. Twitter feeds associated with government departments and official activities form part of the UK Government Web Archive, and the definition is quite broad, for example, stretching to include accounts set up for the mascots of the 2012 London Olympics. I don't know if you remember the quite terrifying Wenlock and Mandeville that paraded around the Olympic Stadium. However, only the official side of the conversation can be archived. Government responses to questions, but not the questions themselves. An important part of our history from below is already disappearing, and the records of central administration are once again being privileged because of legal and technical issues. Archives are also having to grapple with other forms of government-generated born digital data, from whole file systems to personal and departmental email dumps. In February of this year, the National Archives of the UK published 2 excellent reports outlining some of the problems faced and some of the possible solutions to ensuring that this complex and vast material can be managed, preserved, and made available for future generations. While the focus is on UK government records, the description of the general landscape is immediately familiar to anyone who has tried either to archive or work with this kind of data. The urgency of developing appropriate policies and methods is evident from their survey of the number of government departments that are likely to transfer born digital records to the archives each year from 2016 to 2021. There's a roughly 4-fold increase from 12 to 50 in just this 5-year period. Emails seem likely to be particularly difficult because it's much harder to control individual behavior than, for example, when using a single shared file management system. Whatever regulations might notionally be in place, people employ very different email strategies and have very different approaches to separating personal and private communications, with a consequent impact on appraisal and selection. The Digital Landscape in Government 2014-15 report notes the importance of an information management system that is easy to use, but also acknowledges that there is still the possibility that regardless of how easy the system is to use, users still may not take the time to file their emails. That's what happens when you put people in the equation. As an example, one of the government departments surveyed for the report had an electronic document and records management system, but they also had an email server that contained 500 million emails. And that's just one department. This is clearly a problem for archiving institutions, but also for researchers. In the US, the George W. Bush Presidential Library holds 70 million pages of textual material relating to the Bush presidency. But among 80 terabytes of electronic records, there are more than 200 million emails. The email archive contains every copy of every message sent or received by a staff member's White House email account, whether or not the email is a duplicate of another held in the system. The library has published a rather nice case study of emails either sent or received by Alexander Sandy Kress between January and June 2001 concerning the creation of the No Child Left Behind Act. There are 106 emails in total, of which only 23 contain unique content. 83, or 78%, are exact duplicates. And that's, again, a tiny selection, and you're talking about a huge volume of material where we need to identify what's going on. I haven't talked much today about the ethical implications of working with born digital big data. For example, the possibility that linking apparently anonymized large data sets might allow the identification of individuals. But sensitivity of information adds an extra layer of complexity when dealing with government information. While there's an expectation that medical records, for example, are protected personal data, national archives have to balance conflicting statutory obligations around opening up the majority of public records, but holding back for a longer period of time those which are identified as sensitive. The scale of the data to be assessed once again brings new problems. it cannot be assumed that sensitive or confidential information will formally have been identified as such. Yet it's not possible to undertake any form of close reading, and the consequences of accidentally releasing something sensitive could be very serious. Technology poses the challenge here, but perhaps it also provides the solution. The National Archives has been conducting some very interesting experiments around what they refer to as technology-assisted review, using e-discovery software first employed by the legal profession for identifying relevant material for court cases. The report notes that there is no completely automated solution. Human input is still required at all stages, but technology-assisted review offers ways to understand, value, prioritise and reduce the volume of born digital records needing to be manually reviewed. The trials that have been conducted are very promising indeed, but I think it's worth sounding a note of caution. These kinds of solutions cost money. It's no accident that the methodology originated in the field of law, and while they may be available to large national libraries and archives, these are not the only institutions which will have to deal with born digital data. And enterprise-level solutions are, of course, beyond the means of individual researchers and universities, I should add. All of this is to say that there are many challenges associated with big data or data at scale or whatever we end up calling it, and with the born digital in particular, but that we should and indeed must engage with it now. There's a unique opportunity to work with archiving institutions to help shape how all of this information will be accessed in the future, and who wouldn't want to be involved with that? It's one of the reasons I became a researcher. Thank you very much.